The biting wind whipped through the empty streets as Ethan Blackwood guided his sleek black car through the city. Snow clung to the sidewalks in uneven mounds, glittering faintly under the orange glow of the streetlights. It was well past midnight, and he cursed his decision to take the less-traveled road back to his estate. But traffic had been unbearable earlier, and all he wanted was to be home, where the silence of his sprawling mansion awaited. As he approached a narrow intersection, his headlights swept over a figure huddled in a corner. At first, he thought it was a bundle of discarded clothing. Then it moved, a slight, almost imperceptible shiver that made him slow the car to a crawl. He rolled down the window, the frigid air slapping his face, and strained to get a better look. It was a girl, young, frail, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as though trying to shield her body from the cold. Her clothes were little more than rags, and her hair hung in damp, tangled strands around her pale face. Ethan frowned. It wasn't his concern. He told himself that as he tapped the gas, inching forward. But then he stopped. Something about her, something in the way she didn't even look up, didn't even beg, pricked at him. Ethan sighed and reversed the car until he was alongside her. "Hey," he called out. His voice was gruffer than he intended, and the girl flinched but didn't respond. He tried again, this time softer. "Are you okay?" The girl finally looked up, her eyes wide and wary. They were striking eyes, dark and guarded, like a storm brewing on a distant horizon. Ethan felt his chest tighten, though he didn't understand why. "I'm fine," she muttered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Fine." He raised an eyebrow. "You're sitting in the snow, shivering." "That doesn't look fine to me." She shrugged, her thin shoulders trembling under the weight of the cold. Ethan hesitated. He wasn't a man prone to sentimentality. Charity, to him, was something done through foundations and checks, not personal acts. But as he stared at the girl, something inside him shifted, a memory he couldn't quite place stirring in the back of his mind. "Look," he said, his tone more abrupt now, "you'll freeze out here. Get in the car. I'll take you somewhere warm." The girl shook her head, inching back against the wall as though expecting him to force her. "No, I don't know you." Ethan groaned inwardly. She had a point. "I'm not going to hurt you. You can trust me." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, flipping it open to show her his ID. "See? My name's Ethan Blackwood. I'm just trying to help." Her gaze flicked to the ID and back to his face, doubt etched in every line of her expression. But then another gust of icy wind whipped through the alley, and she shuddered violently. Finally, with visible reluctance, she nodded. Ethan opened the passenger door and watched as she climbed in, moving slowly as though her body had forgotten how to function properly. She didn't buckle her seatbelt, just huddled against the door, her arms still clutching her torso. Ethan turned up the heat and handed her a blanket he kept in the back seat for emergencies. "What's your name?" he asked as he pulled back onto the road. She hesitated, then murmured, "Clara." "Well, Clara, you're lucky I found you. You would have frozen to death out there." She didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the dashboard as though it held the answers to her life. Ethan stole glances at her as he drove, trying to make sense of the sudden urge to help her. She was just a girl, a stranger he had no reason to care about. Yet the thought of leaving her out in the cold felt wrong. The rest of the drive passed in silence. When they reached his estate, Clara's eyes widened at the sight of the towering gates and the long, winding driveway. The mansion loomed ahead, its grand facade illuminated by soft outdoor lighting. She didn't say a word as Ethan guided her inside, her footsteps hesitant on the polished marble floor. "You can stay here tonight," he said, leading her to a guest room. "There's a bathroom if you need it. I'll have some food brought up." Clara paused in the doorway, looking at him with a mixture of suspicion and something else. Gratitude, maybe? But she said nothing, simply nodding before slipping into the room. Ethan lingered for a moment, staring at the closed door. Something about her unsettled him, though he couldn't put his finger on it. Shaking his head, he turned away. It was just one night. By morning, she'd be gone, and his life would return to its usual, controlled monotony. Or so he thought. The morning sunlight filtered through the large windows of the mansion, casting a golden glow over the pristine hallways. Ethan Blackwood had been up for hours, his usual routine of early coffee and checking the stock market already completed. Yet, his thoughts were elsewhere. They kept drifting back to the girl he'd found huddled in the cold last night. Clara. He hadn't expected her to have such a presence in his mind, but there she was, lingering like an unfinished conversation. He told himself it was because he wasn't used to having anyone around, let alone a stray teenager who seemed to carry the weight of the world on her narrow shoulders. Deciding he'd check on her before leaving for his office downtown, Ethan made his way to the guest wing. The door to Clara's room was slightly ajar. He knocked gently and, hearing no response, peeked inside. She wasn't in bed. The room, though barely touched, bore signs of her presence. A damp towel draped over the bathroom counter, the blanket he'd left her folded neatly at the edge of the bed. His chest tightened with an odd mixture of relief and unease. As he turned to leave, a flicker of movement caught his eye. Down the hall, Clara stood in front of the library door, her frame almost swallowed by the oversized sweater she'd been given. Her hands rested on the doorknob, hesitating. Ethan approached quietly, his voice low so as not to startle her. "You can go in if you'd like." Clara jumped slightly and turned to face him, her guarded expression quickly slipping back into place. "I didn't want to mess anything up," she mumbled. "It's just books," Ethan said with a small shrug. "They're there to be read." Clara's gaze lingered on the door for a moment before she pushed it open. Ethan followed her inside, the smell of aged paper and polished wood filling the air. She wandered cautiously, her fingers brushing against the spines of the books. It was clear she was trying to appear indifferent, but her fascination was obvious. "What kind of books do you like?" Ethan asked, leaning casually against a bookshelf. "I don't know," she admitted after a pause. "I didn't have many growing up." He frowned, not pushing further. Instead, he let her explore in silence, watching as she paused occasionally to read the titles. Her steps brought her to the far end of the room, where a small collection of family photos sat on a low table. Ethan tensed as Clara's fingers hovered over a framed photograph. "That's my daughter," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of emotions he hadn't intended to reveal. Clara glanced at him, then back at the picture. "She's pretty." "She was," Ethan replied, his throat tightening. He hadn't spoken about her in years, the pain of her disappearance still a raw wound he kept buried. "Her name was Emily." Clara studied the photo, her brow furrowing slightly as though trying to piece something together. Then her gaze shifted to another frame, a portrait of a younger Emily, this time wearing a delicate silver medal around her neck. Ethan saw her eyes widen slightly before she looked away. "That necklace," Clara said hesitantly. "It's the same as mine." Ethan's heart skipped. "What did you say?" Clara stepped back, pulling at the chain around her neck until a small, worn silver medallion emerged from beneath her sweater. Ethan froze. It was unmistakable, the same medal he had given Emily on her 10th birthday, engraved with a tiny, intricate rose on one side. His mind raced, a jumble of disbelief, hope, and confusion. "Where did you get that?" His voice was sharper than he intended, and Clara flinched. "I've always had it," she said defensively. "It was with me when I was little. The people at the orphanage said it was all I had when they found me." Ethan took a step closer, his eyes fixed on the medal. "Do you remember anything else? Anything about where you came from?" Clara shook her head, her expression wary. "No, just bits and pieces. It's all blurry." For a moment, Ethan was silent, his mind spinning with possibilities. He wanted to believe it, to believe that Clara's presence here wasn't just coincidence. But the rational part of him urged caution. There were too many unanswered questions, too many unknowns. "I need to make a call," he said finally, his voice tight. "Wait here." Clara frowned, crossing her arms over her chest. "Why? What's going on?" "I just need to check something." He hesitated, then softened his tone. "Please, trust me." Without waiting for her response, he left the library and headed to his study. His hands trembled slightly as he dialed the number of a private investigator he'd worked with in the past. He explained the situation briefly, his words clipped and urgent. The investigator assured him they'd start looking into Clara's background immediately. Ethan returned to the library to find Clara sitting in one of the armchairs, her posture stiff and her expression unreadable. She didn't look up as he entered, her fingers absently tracing the edges of the metal. "You're hiding something," she said quietly. Ethan stopped in his tracks. "I'm not." "Yes, you are," she interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "You're acting like you know something about me, and it's freaking me out." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know anything for sure. That's why I need to find answers." "Answers to what?" she demanded. "Why do you even care?" The question hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. Ethan wanted to tell her the truth, but he wasn't ready. Not yet. Instead, he said, "Because no one should go through life not knowing where they come from." Clara's eyes softened, though her expression remained guarded. She leaned back in the chair, clutching the metal tightly. "I've never had anyone care about that before," she said after a long pause. Ethan felt a pang of guilt. He wasn't sure if he was doing the right thing, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't turn his back now, not when there was a chance, however slim, that Clara was connected to the daughter he'd lost so many years ago. The hours that followed were tense and heavy with unspoken questions. Clara remained in the library, her guarded expression rarely faltering, while Ethan retreated to his study, pacing restlessly as he awaited any word from the investigator. The metal had ignited a firestorm in his mind, and every logical part of him screamed for patience, for restraint. But the possibility was there, teasing him with its cruel hope. By mid-afternoon, his phone buzzed. Ethan snatched it up with shaking hands. "I've got preliminary results," the investigator said, his voice calm but cautious. "The orphanage records confirm a child matching Clara's description arrived there around the time your daughter disappeared. But the paper trail is thin. It looks like someone went out of their way to erase details. No birth certificate, no parent names, just a note that she was found in a park wrapped in a blanket." Ethan gripped the edge of his desk. "And the medallion? Unusual design, definitely custom. I'd bet it's a match for the one in the photographs you sent. I'll need more time to confirm with absolute certainty, but it's compelling, compelling." Ethan hung on the word like a lifeline. It wasn't definitive, but it was enough to push him further. He thanked the investigator and ended the call, his thoughts racing. There were too many gaps, too many unknowns. But for the first time in years, the pieces didn't feel impossible to fit together. Ethan returned to the library, where Clara had settled into a chair with a book. She glanced up as he entered, her dark eyes wary. "What was that about?" she asked, her tone sharp. He hesitated, considering how much to reveal. "I've started looking into your past," he said carefully. "That medal. It belonged to my daughter." Clara stared at him, her expression flickering between disbelief and suspicion. "Your daughter? What does that have to do with me?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out," Ethan replied. "There's a chance you're connected to her. Maybe," his voice faltered, "maybe you're her daughter." Clara froze, the book slipping from her hands to the floor. "What? No, that's not possible." "It might be," he insisted gently. "You said you don't know much about where you came from. If we dig deeper, we might find answers. For both of us." Clara shook her head, her arms wrapping around herself as though to shield against his words. "Why would you even think that? I'm just some random girl. I don't belong here." Ethan stepped closer, his voice softening. "You belong somewhere, Clara. And if there's even a chance you're part of my family, I have to know." Her gaze dropped to the metal, which she clutched tightly in her hands. For a long moment, the room was silent except for the faint crackle of the fire in the hearth. When she finally spoke, her voice was small. "I don't know if I want to know." Her words caught Ethan off guard. "Why not?" "Because," she hesitated, her fingers tightening around the chain. "What if it doesn't change anything? What if it just makes things worse?" Ethan crouched beside her chair, his tone earnest. "Finding the truth can be hard, but living without it, living with the questions, can be even harder. I've spent the last 20 years wondering what happened to my daughter, blaming myself for losing her. If there's a chance to get even a piece of her back, I have to take it." Clara looked at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I've spent my whole life thinking no one cared about where I came from. I don't know how to trust that you do. You don't have to trust me yet, Ethan said quietly, but I'm not going anywhere. I promise you that. Her shoulders sagged, and for the first time, the walls she'd built around herself seemed to crack. Okay, she whispered. I'll try. Ethan nodded, relief washing over him. That's all I asked. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The investigator uncovered more details, piecing together a fragmented story of Clara's early years. The blanket she'd been found with bore the faint initials EB, the same as Emily Blackwood. Hospital records showed a girl matching her description treated for minor injuries not long after Emily's disappearance, though the records had been filed under an alias. Each discovery felt like another layer of proof, and with every piece, Ethan's hope grew stronger. Clara, meanwhile, wrestled with conflicting emotions. She couldn't deny the growing evidence that tied her to Ethan's family, but the idea of belonging to someone, of having a history that mattered, felt foreign and frightening. She'd spent so long believing she was unworthy of love or connection that the possibility of it now felt almost like a trick. One evening, she wandered into the study where Ethan was poring over the latest findings. He looked up, surprised to see her. Everything okay? She hesitated, then nodded. I wanted to thank you for caring. Even if this doesn't turn out the way you hope. Ethan set the papers aside and gestured for her to sit. Clara, no matter what we find, you matter. Whether you're my granddaughter or not, you're not alone anymore. I need you to know that. Her lip quivered, and for the first time, she let herself believe him. She sat down, and the two of them talked late into the night. Not about investigations or evidence, but about memories, dreams, and fears. Slowly, cautiously, a bond began to form. When the final piece of proof arrived, a DNA test confirming the connection, Ethan was overwhelmed. Clara, however, struggled to process the truth. She wasn't just a nobody from the streets. She was Emily Blackwood's daughter. But what did that mean for her now? Could she truly step into this new identity, this new family, after everything she'd been through? As Ethan hugged her for the first time, both of them overcome with emotion, Clara realized that while the answers might not erase her pain, they gave her something she'd never had before, a place to start again. The following days were a strange mix of quiet and chaos. The DNA results left no doubt. Clara was Emily Blackwood's daughter, Ethan's granddaughter. Yet, the certainty brought with it a tide of emotions neither Ethan nor Clara were prepared to face. The revelations had unlocked years of buried grief for Ethan and stirred an uneasy hope in Clara that she was reluctant to trust. Ethan, for his part, felt an overwhelming responsibility. He'd spent 2 decades living with the weight of his failure to protect his daughter, and now he had a chance, however small, to set things right. But the path forward was uncertain, and Clara's guarded demeanor made him realize that earning her trust wouldn't be immediate. She was a girl shaped by years of abandonment, of learning not to rely on anyone but herself. One morning, Ethan found Clara sitting alone in the garden, staring out at the frost-covered grounds. She was wrapped in one of the mansion's thick coats, her knees pulled up to her chest. She didn't look up as he approached, but he could tell she knew he was there. It's beautiful out here, she said softly, her breath visible in the crisp air. Ethan nodded, sliding his hands into his pockets. Emily loved it too. She used to spend hours in the garden, especially in the winter. Said it made her feel peaceful. Clara glanced at him, her expression unreadable. Do you think she'd want me here? The question caught Ethan off guard. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I think she'd be overjoyed to know you're alive. She'd want to know everything about you. Your favorite things, your dreams. She'd want to be a part of your life. Clara looked away, her fingers fidgeting with the edges of her coat. I don't even know who I am. How can I be part of something when I don't fit? You fit more than you realize, Ethan said. You don't have to have all the answers right now. None of us do. But you're not alone anymore, Clara. That's what matters. For the first time, she allowed herself a small smile, though it was fleeting. I'm not used to this. Someone sticking around. Ethan sat down on the bench beside her, careful to leave some space. I've made my share of mistakes, Clara, more than I care to admit. But I promise you this. I'm here for as long as you'll let me be. The quiet promise lingered between them, and for a moment, Clara seemed to relax. She didn't say anything else, but her silence wasn't as heavy as it had been before. It was a start. Later that day, Ethan received a call from his investigator. The man had uncovered new information, details about Emily's life after her disappearance. The discovery sent a ripple of shock through Ethan. His daughter had been alive for years after he lost her, living under a different name in a different state. But the trail ended abruptly 3 years ago, and the investigator suspected she had passed away. Ethan felt a mixture of grief and relief. Grief for the years he'd lost with her, for the hardships she must have endured. Relief that, even in her absence, she had left behind a piece of herself in Clara. But the mystery of her life, and her disappearance, remained unresolved, leaving Ethan with more questions than answers. When he shared the news with Clara, she took it quietly, her face betraying little emotion. But later that evening, Ethan heard muffled sobs coming from her room. He didn't intrude, though it pained him to leave her alone in her grief. He knew this wasn't a pain that could be eased with words. In the days that followed, Clara began to open up in small ways. She started asking questions about Emily, what she was like as a child, what her favorite memories were. Ethan, in turn, shared stories, each one painting a picture of the bright, spirited girl he remembered. Clara listened intently, clinging to these fragments of a mother she'd never known. One evening, as they sat in the library, Clara picked up the photograph of Emily wearing the silver medal. She studied it for a long time before speaking. "Do you think she ever tried to find me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's heart ached at the question. "I believe she did. She loved you, Clara. I'm sure of it." Clara nodded slowly, though her expression remained pensive. "It's weird. You know, for so long, I thought I didn't matter, that no one cared where I was or if I existed. And now you know you were loved," Ethan finished gently. "Even if life kept you apart, that love was always there." She looked at him then, her eyes glistening. "I want to believe that." "You can," Ethan said firmly. "You should." As their bond deepened, Ethan found himself imagining a future he hadn't dared to hope for. A future where Clara felt safe and loved, where the ghosts of the past no longer haunted them both. He started making changes to his estate, turning unused spaces into places Clara could make her own. He encouraged her to think about her dreams, her aspirations, though he never pushed too hard. He wanted her to know she had time to figure things out. But just as they began to find their footing, an unexpected complication arose. A man from Clara's past, a figure she had hoped to leave behind, resurfaced, threatening the fragile stability they had built. Ethan was immediately protective, but Clara insisted on confronting the situation herself, determined to prove that she wasn't the scared, helpless girl she had been before. The confrontation was tense, but it marked a turning point for Clara. Standing up to her past allowed her to see how far she had come, how much strength she had gained. It wasn't the end of her struggles, but it was a step forward, a step toward believing she deserved the life she was beginning to build with Ethan. As they sat together that night, watching the fire crackle in the hearth, Clara turned to Ethan with a quiet determination. "Thank you," she said, "for not giving up on me." Ethan reached out, resting a hand on her shoulder. "We're family, Clara. That's what family does." For the first time, Clara allowed herself to believe it. The mansion was quiet that evening, save for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Clara sat cross-legged on the plush rug in the library, a notebook in front of her. She hadn't written anything yet. The blank pages stared back at her, as if challenging her to put her thoughts into words. Across the room, Ethan sat in his leather armchair, pretending to read but occasionally glancing over at her. "Do you ever write things down?" Clara asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Ethan looked up, surprised by the question. "Not often. I suppose I've always been more of a numbers person." Clara traced the edge of the notebook with her finger. "I used to write a little, when I was younger. Just silly stuff. Stories I'd make up about places I'd never been." "That doesn't sound silly to me," Ethan said. setting his book aside. What kinds of stories? Clara shrugged, her expression distant. Mostly about finding a home, a place where I belonged. Somewhere I didn't have to keep running. Ethan's chest tightened at her words. You're not running anymore, he said softly. You've found that place now. She didn't respond right away, but the faintest smile tugged at her lips. Maybe, she said after a moment, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm starting to think it's possible. They fell into a comfortable silence again, the kind that no longer felt heavy or awkward. Clara returned her focus to the notebook, and Ethan watched her for a moment longer before picking up his book again. He didn't read a single word, though. His thoughts were too tangled, a mix of gratitude for how far they'd come and worry for what lay ahead. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Ethan had just finished breakfast when his housekeeper informed him that a man was at the gate, demanding to speak with him. His gut tightened at the description. Rough-looking individual with a confrontational air. Ethan's first thought was Clara. He had no doubt this was connected to her past. He instructed the housekeeper to keep the man at the gate and went to find Clara. She was in the kitchen, nibbling on a piece of toast and flipping through a magazine. The moment she saw Ethan's expression, her face fell. What's wrong? She asked. There's someone at the gate, Ethan said carefully. A man. He seems agitated. Do you know who it might be? Clara's hands froze mid-motion, the toast slipping from her fingers onto the plate. Her face drained of color. It's him, she said in a low, shaky voice. It has to be. Who is he? Ethan asked, his tone gentle but firm. Clara hesitated, her breathing shallow. His name's Travis. He's someone I knew on the streets. I owe him money. A lot of money. Ethan's jaw tightened. He wanted to demand why she hadn't told him sooner, but he could see the fear in her eyes, the way her hands trembled as she tried to steady herself. You don't owe him anything, he said firmly. Not anymore. You don't understand, Clara said, her voice rising. Travis doesn't just let things go. He'll make my life hell. He won't touch you, Ethan interrupted, his voice resolute. Not while you're here. Clara stared at him, her eyes wide. You don't know what he's capable of, and he doesn't know what I'm capable of, Ethan replied. Stay here. I'll handle this. Before she could protest, Ethan left the room, his stride purposeful. He wasn't entirely sure what he'd say to the man, but one thing was certain. He wouldn't let anyone threaten Clara. Not now, not ever. At the gate, Travis leaned against the iron bars, his expression smug. He was a wiry man with a scruffy beard and eyes that darted around as though constantly scanning for threats. Ethan approached calmly, his presence commanding despite the casual clothes he wore. You must be the guy playing hero, Travis drawled, his voice dripping with disdain. You've got something that belongs to me. Ethan's expression didn't waver. Clara doesn't belong to anyone. Sure she does, Travis sneered. She owes me. And unless you want her little world here to come crashing down, you'll pay what she owes. Ethan stepped closer to the gate, his eyes cold. If you think you can intimidate me, you've made a mistake. Whatever debt you think Clara owes is gone. She's under my protection now. Travis sparked a laugh. Protection? You think money can fix this? No, Ethan said calmly. But power can. And I have more of it than you'll ever know. Leave now, and I'll forget this conversation ever happened. Stay, and I'll make sure you regret it. The threat hung in the air, palpable. Travis's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. You think you scare me? You're just some rich old man. Ethan didn't let him finish. I don't need to scare you, he said quietly. I just need to make sure you understand what will happen if you push me. Walk away, Travis. It's your only option. For a long moment, the two men stared each other down. Then, finally, Travis stepped back from the gate, his expression sour. This isn't over, he muttered before turning and walking away. Ethan watched until Travis disappeared down the road, his shoulders tense. He knew men like Travis. They thrived on control and fear. But he also knew they were cowards at their core. For now, the threat was gone. But he had no doubt it would resurface. When he returned to the house, Clara was waiting anxiously by the front door. What happened? she asked, her voice trembling. He's gone, Ethan said simply. He won't bother you again. Clara looked at him, her eyes filling with tears. You don't understand. He always comes back. Ethan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Not this time. I'll make sure of it. For the first time in years, Clara felt a flicker of safety. Real safety. Not the fleeting kind she'd chased all her life. It was fragile, like a bird learning to fly, but it was there. And for the first time, she allowed herself to hope it might last. Ethan knew the encounter with Travis had unsettled Clara, even if she tried to hide it. The walls she had started to let down were back up, her every movement laced with a nervous energy. She avoided the library and spent most of her time in the garden or her room, as though staying on the edges of the house might somehow keep her safe. One evening, Ethan found her in the kitchen, rinsing off a mug she'd barely touched. She flinched when he entered, but quickly masked it with a forced smile. Couldn't sleep? He asked gently. Clara shrugged. Something like that. He leaned against the counter, studying her. You don't have to carry this alone, Clara. Whatever you're feeling, it's okay to talk about it. Her hands stilled in the water, but she didn't turn around. Talking doesn't fix things, she said quietly. It doesn't make people like Travis go away. Maybe not, Ethan agreed, his voice calm. But it can make things feel less heavy. Clara shook her head, shutting off the faucet. You don't get it. People like him. They don't just let you walk away. I thought I was done with that life, but it doesn't work like that. Ethan stepped closer, his tone firm but kind. You're not in that life anymore. You're here now, and you're not alone. I'll do whatever it takes to protect you. Her shoulders sagged slightly, but she still didn't meet his eyes. Why? Why do you even care so much? The question hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. Ethan took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. Because you're my family, Clara, and family doesn't give up on each other. She finally turned to face him, her expression torn between skepticism and something softer, something like hope. You really believe that? I do, he said simply. For a moment, she stood there, as if trying to decide whether to trust him. Then she nodded, the smallest hint of a smile ghosting across her lips. Okay, it wasn't much, but it was enough for Ethan. He didn't press her further, letting her retreat back to her room when she was ready. Progress, he reminded himself, came in small steps. The next morning, Ethan reached out to his investigator again, this time with a more direct request. He wanted every detail about Travis's history, every thread of influence the man might still have. If Travis posed a real threat, Ethan needed to know exactly what he was up against. The report arrived 2 days later. It confirmed much of what Ethan had suspected. Travis was a small-time criminal, using intimidation and manipulation to maintain control over vulnerable people. His network wasn't large, but it was persistent. More troubling, the report suggested that Travis had a history of seeking out ways to exploit people who owed him money, often threatening their safety to ensure compliance. Ethan read the report twice, his anger simmering just below the surface. He'd seen men like Travis before in his business dealings, opportunists who thrived on fear. But this wasn't about a corporate deal or a financial dispute. This was personal, and Ethan wasn't going to let Clara's future be dictated by someone like Travis. He called his legal team next, explaining the situation in broad strokes. They assured him they could help establish protections for Clara, including restraining orders and measures to secure the estate. But Ethan knew paperwork alone wouldn't keep Travis at bay. He needed to send a message, one that would ensure Travis understood the consequences of pushing any further. Later that week, Ethan met with one of his most trusted security advisors, a man named Marcus who had worked with him for years. Marcus was a calm, imposing figure with a talent for resolving problems before they escalated. I need this handled, Ethan said, sliding the investigator's report across the desk. Quietly but effectively, Marcus scanned the document, his expression unreadable. I'll take care of it, he said finally. Travis won't come near her again. Ethan nodded, relief mingling with the tension that had taken residence in his chest since the confrontation at the gate. Thank you. While Marcus worked behind the scenes, Ethan focused on rebuilding the sense of safety Clara had begun to lose. He encouraged her to spend more time in the house, even suggesting they tackle small projects together. When she mentioned an interest in art, he surprised her with a set of sketchbooks and pencils. At first, she was hesitant to accept, but over time, she began to use them, her drawings tentative but expressive. One evening, as Ethan was finishing up some paperwork in his study, Clara appeared in the doorway. She held a sketchbook in her hands, her posture shy but determined. "I wanted to show you something," she said. Ethan set his pen down and gestured for her to come in. She hesitated before crossing the room and handing him the sketchbook. He opened it to a page where she had drawn a scene from the garden, a delicate rendering of the frost-covered roses she often admired. "This is beautiful," he said, genuinely impressed. "You have real talent." Clara shifted nervously. "I wasn't sure if it was any good." "It's more than good," Ethan assured her. "It's incredible." Her face softened at the praise, and for the first time in days, she seemed at ease. "Thanks," she said quietly. Ethan handed the sketchbook back to her, his voice warm. "You should keep doing this. It's something that's yours, something no one can take away." Clara nodded, her grip on the sketchbook tightening. "I will." As the days turned into weeks, Clara's confidence began to grow. She started venturing into parts of the house she'd previously avoided, even joining Ethan for meals without needing to be coaxed. The shadows of her past still lingered, but they no longer seemed to define her. Ethan, too, found himself changing. The once empty mansion felt alive again, filled with the quiet presence of someone who was slowly becoming a part of his world. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel hope, a fragile, tentative hope that they could build something lasting together. But even as they found moments of peace, Ethan couldn't ignore the possibility that Travis might resurface. He knew their journey was far from over, but he also knew this: he wouldn't let anyone take Clara away from the life she deserved. Not now, not ever. The winter days grew longer, and with each passing week, Clara seemed to shed more of the burdens she'd carried. Ethan noticed the small changes first: the way she no longer hesitated before sitting down at the dining table, the way she lingered in the library instead of retreating to her room. She still had moments of doubt, but they were fewer now, her guarded expression softening into something that resembled peace. One crisp afternoon, Ethan found Clara in the garden, bundled in a coat as she sketched in her notebook. Her focus was intense, her pencil moving with purpose across the page. He approached quietly, not wanting to disturb her. When she noticed him, she closed the notebook instinctively, a habit she hadn't quite shaken. "You don't have to hide it," he said gently. "I'd love to see what you're working on." Clara hesitated, her fingers lingering on the cover of the sketchbook. Finally, she sighed and handed it to him. Ethan opened it to find a detailed drawing of the mansion's fountain, its frozen surface capturing the winter light in delicate shades of gray and white. Surrounding the fountain were hints of warmth, flowers that didn't bloom this time of year, but seemed to symbolize a spring that Clara imagined. "This is incredible," he said, genuine admiration in his voice. "You have a gift, Clara." She shrugged, a small smile tugging at her lips. "It helps me think. When I draw, it's like everything else fades for a while." Ethan handed the sketchbook back to her. "You should hold on to that. It's a strength, being able to create something beautiful from nothing." Clara looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "Do you really think things can be beautiful after everything? After so much has gone wrong?" "I do," Ethan said without hesitation. "Life isn't perfect. It's messy, painful, and unfair at times. But it's also resilient. You're proof of that." She didn't respond right away, but her eyes softened. "I want to believe that." "You will," Ethan said, his voice steady. "Give it time." Their conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of a car approaching. Ethan tensed immediately, his mind flashing back to Travis and the threats he'd made. He placed a protective hand on Clara's shoulder. "Stay here," he said firmly, heading toward the front of the house. At the gate, Marcus stood waiting, his posture calm but authoritative. The car parked just outside belonged to a local courier service, and the driver handed over a package before leaving. Marcus nodded to Ethan as he approached. "Nothing to worry about," Marcus said, sensing Ethan's concern. "But I'll keep watch just in case." Ethan relaxed, though only slightly. He trusted Marcus to keep them safe, but the tension from Travis's earlier intrusion still lingered. The package itself was unremarkable, just an envelope addressed to Ethan, but something about it felt off. He brought it inside, opening it carefully at his desk. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the message typed in bold letters. "You think you've won, but you haven't. People like me don't go away. We wait." Ethan's grip tightened on the paper. It wasn't signed, but he didn't need a name to know who had sent it. Travis was trying to rattle him, to remind him that his influence still loomed. Ethan's first instinct was to call Marcus back in, to escalate security measures, but he forced himself to pause. Reacting impulsively was exactly what Travis wanted. Instead, Ethan took a deep breath and focused. This wasn't just about protecting Clara physically. It was about showing her that fear didn't have to control her life. He folded the note and placed it in a drawer. He'd handle Travis, but on his own terms. Later that evening, Ethan and Clara sat together by the fire, a quiet comfort settling between them. Clara was reading, her legs tucked under her, while Ethan nursed a glass of wine. The soft glow of the flames danced across the room, making the moment feel almost surreal in its warmth. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Of course," Ethan replied, setting his glass down. "What was she like?" "My mom, I mean." Her voice was tentative, as though she wasn't sure she was ready to hear the answer. Ethan leaned back, his gaze distant as memories flooded his mind. She was vibrant, stubborn, too. Once she set her mind on something, there was no stopping her. But she was kind, always thinking about others. She had this laugh that could fill a room. It was impossible not to smile when you heard it. Clara smiled faintly. "I wish I could remember her." "You carry pieces of her," Ethan said, his tone gentle. "In the way you're strong, in the way you care about the world even when it hasn't always been kind to you. She's a part of you, whether you remember her or not." Clara looked down at her hands, her expression pensive. "Do you think she'd be proud of me?" Ethan's voice was firm. "I don't think, I know. She'd be incredibly proud of you, Clara, for everything you've survived, for the person you're becoming." Her eyes shimmered, and she quickly blinked back tears. "I'm trying," she said softly. "I really am." "I know you are," Ethan said, "and you're not alone in this. You never have to be alone again." The rest of the evening passed quietly, but the weight of their conversation lingered in Ethan's mind. He knew how much it had cost Clara to open up, to let herself be vulnerable. It was a sign of trust, and he vowed to honor that trust by keeping her safe, no matter what it took. As the fire dwindled and the house settled into silence, Ethan found himself thinking not of the threats that loomed but of the possibilities ahead. Clara's presence had brought something back into his life he hadn't realized he'd lost: hope. And no matter what challenges lay ahead, he was determined to hold on to it. Together, they would face whatever came next. The next morning, the mansion buzzed with a quiet energy as the staff prepared for a routine security upgrade Ethan had ordered after receiving Travis's note. Clara stayed out of the way, retreating to the library with her sketchbook. She felt the unease in the air, but she also noticed something else. Ethan was calmer than she expected. His steady presence gave her an odd sense of comfort, a feeling she wasn't used to. She spent most of the day sketching, losing herself in the lines and shapes that flowed from her pencil. It was easier than thinking about the note Ethan had mentioned, or the possibility of Travis lurking somewhere nearby. By mid-afternoon, though, her focus wavered. She closed the sketchbook and wandered into the kitchen, where she found Ethan sitting at the counter, reading through a stack of papers. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice tentative. He looked up, his face softening when he saw her. "Better than okay," he said. "Just making sure we're prepared for, him?" Clara asked hesitantly, not wanting to say Travis's name aloud. Ethan nodded. "Marcus has everything under control. You don't need to worry." She shifted uncomfortably, leaning against the counter. "I can't help it. It's like, every time I think I'm free, something pulls me back. Like I'll never really get away." "You're not the person you were when he had power over you," Ethan said firmly. "And you're not alone anymore. That makes all the difference." Clara bit her lip, unsure how to respond. Part of her wanted to believe him, to trust that things could be different now. But the other part, the part shaped by years of survival, told her it was dangerous to let her guard down. She looked at Ethan, his calm reassurance etched in every line of his face, and wondered how he could be so certain. That evening, Ethan received a call from Marcus, who had been keeping tabs on Travis. The update was both reassuring and concerning. Travis had left the area for now, likely spooked by Ethan's earlier confrontation and Marcus's quiet interventions. But men like Travis didn't disappear forever. Marcus warned that it was only a matter of time before he tried something again. Ethan thanked Marcus and hung up, the weight of the situation pressing against his chest. He knew this wasn't over, but for now, Clara was safe. That was all that mattered. The next few days passed uneventfully, and slowly, the tension in the house began to ease. Clara seemed lighter, her smiles coming more easily, though Ethan could still sense the occasional flicker of doubt behind her eyes. He encouraged her to keep sketching, even going so far as to clear out a small room near the garden to serve as her personal studio. When he showed it to her, her reaction was subdued at first. She stared at the empty space, as though unsure it could truly be hers. "You can make it anything you want," Ethan said. "A place that's just for you." Clara nodded, her expression unreadable. "I've never had anything like this before." "Well, you do now," Ethan said simply. She spent the rest of the day arranging the room, carefully setting up her sketchbooks, pencils, and the small collection of art supplies Ethan had bought for her. When she finally stepped back to admire her work, a small smile crept across her face. It wasn't much yet, but it was hers. Ethan noticed the change in her almost immediately. The studio gave her a sense of purpose, something to focus on beyond the shadows of her past. She started spending hours there, losing herself in her drawings. She even began to experiment with color, timidly adding splashes of paint to her sketches. One afternoon, Ethan stopped by to check on her and found her in the middle of a new piece. It was a landscape, vibrant and full of life, a stark contrast to the muted tones of her earlier work. He watched as she carefully blended shades of green and blue, her concentration absolute. "This is beautiful," he said, breaking the silence. Clara jumped slightly, not having heard him enter. She looked at the painting, then back at him. "It's not finished." "It's already amazing," Ethan said. "You've got real talent, Clara." Her cheeks flushed slightly, and she turned back to the canvas. "Thanks." Ethan hesitated before speaking again. "Have you thought about what you want to do with your art? I mean, beyond this room?" Clara shrugged, her brush pausing mid-stroke. "I don't know. I never thought I'd get to do anything with it." "Well, maybe it's time to start thinking about it," Ethan said. "You've got something special here. It could be more than just a hobby." Clara didn't respond right away, but the idea lingered in her mind. She'd never allowed herself to imagine a future like that, a future where her art could mean something, where it could be a part of who she was. It felt overwhelming, but also exciting. As the days turned into weeks, Clara began to embrace the possibilities Ethan had encouraged her to consider. She researched art schools and local galleries, though she didn't tell Ethan yet. It felt too fragile, too new, to share. But for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to hope for something more. Ethan, meanwhile, kept a close eye on her progress, quietly supporting her while continuing to ensure her safety. He knew Travis was still out there, but he refused to let the man's shadow darken Clara's newfound light. Whatever it took, he would keep her safe. One evening, as they sat together in the library, Clara spoke up unexpectedly. "I think I want to try selling some of my work, just to see if anyone likes it." Ethan smiled, his chest swelling with pride. "I think that's a great idea. You let me know how I can help." Clara's smile was small but genuine. "Thanks. For everything." "You don't have to thank me," Ethan said. "This is all you, Clara. You're finding your way." And for the first time, Clara believed him. The days grew longer, the chill of winter gradually giving way to the first hints of spring. Clara's small studio had become her sanctuary, the once empty space now vibrant with sketches, paintings, and an array of colors that reflected her slowly emerging confidence. Ethan noticed how she moved differently now, more purposefully, her head held a little higher. It wasn't a complete transformation. There were still moments when her past weighed heavily on her. But those moments were fewer, and the light in her eyes seemed to linger longer. One afternoon, Clara approached Ethan in his study, holding a small stack of her finished pieces. She hesitated at the doorway, her arms clutching the papers as though they might slip away if she didn't hold on tightly. "Do you have a minute?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. Ethan looked up from his desk, immediately setting aside the documents he'd been reviewing. "Always. Come in." Clara stepped inside and laid the stack of artwork on the desk. "I've been thinking about what you said, about doing something with my art." Ethan smiled, a warm, encouraging expression that put her at ease. "And I want to try," she said, her words measured but firm. "I don't know if anyone will like them, but I'd like to see if they do. Maybe it could lead to something." Ethan flipped through the pieces, taking in the vivid landscapes, tender portraits, and abstract designs that seemed to pulse with emotion. "Clara, these are incredible. People aren't just going to like them. They're going to love them." Clara's cheeks flushed, but a small smile tugged at her lips. "You really think so?" I know," Ethan said. "Let's start small. We can look into local galleries or community events. It's a good way to get your work out there." Clara nodded, her excitement tempered by nervousness. "I don't even know where to begin." "That's where I come in," Ethan said. "We'll figure it out together." Over the next few weeks, Ethan and Clara worked to prepare her for her first showing. With Ethan's connections, they secured a spot at a small community art fair, a modest but promising start. Clara was hesitant at first, reluctant to put herself in the spotlight, but Ethan's steady encouragement bolstered her resolve. On the morning of the fair, Clara stood in front of the mirror in her room, studying her reflection. She'd chosen a simple outfit, a soft sweater and jeans, but her hands fidgeted with the hem as her nerves began to creep in. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "You ready?" Ethan asked, his tone light but supportive. Clara turned to him, her expression uncertain. What if no one likes them? Ethan stepped inside, his voice calm. "Then we learn from it and try again. But I don't think that's going to happen. Your work speaks to people, Clara. Trust me." She nodded, taking a deep breath. "Okay, let's do this." The fair was held in a local park, rows of tents and booths set up beneath the budding trees. The atmosphere buzzed with energy. Families wandering from booth to booth, children laughing as they chased each other, and the hum of conversation mingling with the soft strains of live music. Clara's booth was modest, but Ethan had made sure it was well prepared. Her paintings were displayed on easels, each one carefully arranged to draw the eye. As the hours passed, Clara's initial nerves began to ebb. People stopped to admire her work, their kind words and genuine interest giving her a confidence she hadn't felt before. Ethan stayed nearby, offering quiet encouragement when she needed it, but he made sure to let her take the lead. By midday, Clara had sold 3 pieces, an achievement that left her both shocked and elated. She was in the middle of explaining one of her abstract pieces to a young couple when she spotted a familiar face in the distance. Her heart sank as Travis approached, his eyes scanning the booths until they landed on her. Ethan noticed the shift in her demeanor immediately. He followed her gaze and saw Travis making his way toward them, his posture casual but his expression predatory. Ethan stepped forward, positioning himself between Travis and Clara. "This isn't the place for you," Ethan said, his tone low and firm. Travis smirked, his hands shoved in his pockets. "Relax, old man. I'm just here to browse." Ethan's voice hardened. "Leave. Now." For a moment, Travis seemed to consider his options, his gaze flicking between Ethan and Clara. Finally, he raised his hands in mock surrender. "Fine, I'm going." But this isn't over. As Travis turned and walked away, Clara released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Ethan turned back to her, his expression a mix of concern and reassurance. "Are you okay?" he asked. Clara nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. "Yeah, I hate that he can still get to me." "He can't," Ethan said firmly. "Not anymore. You've worked too hard to let him take this from you." Clara looked at him, her eyes glistening. Thanks for standing up for me. Ethan placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. You're stronger than you think, Clara. Don't let him make you doubt that. The rest of the day passed without incident, and by the time the fair ended, Clara had sold 5 pieces. The experience left her both exhausted and exhilarated, a new sense of possibility taking root in her mind. That evening, as they sat together in the living room, Clara looked at Ethan, her expression thoughtful. I think I'm ready, she said. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Ready for what? To start really living, she said, her voice steady. I've spent so much time surviving, just trying to get through the day. But now, I want more. I want to build something, to see what I can do. Ethan smiled, pride and admiration filling his chest. You've already started, Clara, and I'll be here every step of the way. For the first time, Clara felt the weight of her past begin to lift. She didn't know exactly what the future held, but for the first time, she believed it could be hers to shape. The following weeks unfolded like a new chapter in Clara's life, one she had never dared to imagine. The art fair had been a turning point, not just for her work, but for her confidence. Each step forward felt lighter, as though she were slowly shedding the weight of her past. She spent her days in her studio, experimenting with new techniques, and her nights often with Ethan, sharing stories or simply enjoying the quiet comfort of his presence. Ethan noticed the change in her. Clara smiled more now, even laughed occasionally, and her guarded demeanor was giving way to something softer. He couldn't help but feel proud, though he knew there were still shadows lingering at the edges of her happiness. Travis was one of them. Ethan had taken every precaution to ensure the man stayed away, but the memory of his threats lingered in the back of his mind. One morning, Clara came to the breakfast table with a piece of paper in hand, her expression a mix of excitement and nerves. Ethan looked up from his coffee, immediately sensing that she had something important to share. What's this? He asked as she handed it to him. It's an application, Clara said, for an art program. It's local, just a community thing, but I think it could help me get better, and maybe meet other artists. Ethan scanned the paper, a smile spreading across his face. This is a great idea, Clara. Have you filled it out yet? Not yet, she admitted. I wanted to make sure I wasn't rushing into it. You're not, Ethan said firmly. You're taking a step towards something you love. That's never a bad thing. Her smile was small but genuine as she sat down across from him. Do you think they'll accept me? I think they'd be crazy not to, Ethan said. And if you need any recommendations, you know where to find me. Clara laughed softly, a sound that filled the room with warmth. Thanks, Ethan, for everything. You don't need to thank me, he said. This is all you. The days that followed were busy as Clara worked on her application, carefully selecting pieces to submit with it. Ethan offered guidance when she asked, but made sure to let her take the lead. He knew how important it was for her to feel ownership of this step. By the time she sent off the application, her nerves had settled into a quiet excitement, and Ethan couldn't help but admire her determination. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Ethan brought up a subject he had been hesitant to broach. Clara, he began, his tone cautious. I've been thinking about something. About your mom. Clara looked up from her sketchbook, her expression curious but calm. What about her? There's still so much we don't know about what happened to her, Ethan said. I was wondering if you'd want to look into it. Together. Clara's eyes softened, and she set the sketchbook aside. You think we could find out more? I do, Ethan said. I've already asked my investigator to keep digging, but I didn't want to push anything without talking to you first. Clara nodded slowly, her gaze thoughtful. I think I'd like that. I want to know more about her. About who she was. Ethan reached across the coffee table, placing a hand over hers. Then we'll do it, whatever it takes. The conversation reignited Ethan's determination to uncover the truth about Emily's disappearance. He worked closely with Marcus and his investigator, piecing together fragments of information that painted a clearer picture of the years Emily had spent away from them. The details were painful, stories of struggle and isolation, but they also revealed a fierce love for Clara, one that had driven Emily to protect her daughter at all costs. As the pieces fell into place, A picture emerged of a woman who had faced unimaginable challenges but had never given up on the hope of reuniting with her family. Clara listened to each discovery with a mix of emotions: grief for the mother she had lost, pride in her strength, and a deep yearning to honor her legacy. One day, while going through a box of items recovered from Emily's past, Clara found a letter addressed to her. The paper was worn, the handwriting delicate, but unmistakably her mother's. With trembling hands, Clara unfolded the letter and began to read. "My dearest Clara, if you're reading this, it means I couldn't be with you the way I wanted. But know this, you were my greatest joy, my reason for everything. I loved you more than words can say, and I never stopped fighting for you. Wherever life takes you, I hope you find happiness, love, and a place where you belong. And I hope you know how proud I am of you. Always." Tears streamed down Clara's face as she clutched the letter to her chest. Ethan sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders, offering silent comfort as she let the emotions wash over her. "I feel like I know her now," Clara said through her tears. "Like I finally understand how much she loved me." "She did," Ethan said softly, "and she'd be so proud of you." The letter became a turning point for Clara, solidifying her resolve to move forward. She continued her art, pouring her emotions into each piece, and began connecting with other artists through the program she had applied to. When her acceptance letter arrived, she ran to Ethan with tears of joy, and they celebrated together with a quiet dinner at home. By the time spring fully bloomed, Clara's life had transformed in ways she hadn't thought possible. She still carried the scars of her past, but they no longer defined her. She was building a future, one filled with art, purpose, and the unshakable bond she had formed with Ethan. On a warm evening, as they sat in the garden watching the sun set, Clara turned to Ethan, her expression thoughtful. "You know," she said, "for the longest time, I didn't think I deserved any of this. A home, a family, a second chance. And now?" Ethan asked, his voice steady. "Now I think maybe I do," she said. "Thanks to you." Ethan smiled, his heart full. "You've always deserved it, Clara. You just needed someone to remind you." As the last rays of sunlight bathed the garden in gold, Clara leaned back in her chair, a sense of peace settling over her. For the first time in her life, she felt truly at home, and she knew, deep down, that her story was just beginning.